Hello, and welcome to the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Forum on COVID-19 and Youth, Beyond 2020, the Next Normal. My name is Giza Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of the YJI. We have a diverse audience here today. Many of you come from local and state governments in New York and all over the country, as well as universities, nonprofits, and research centers from near and far. Thank you very, very much for joining us. And thanks also for your stamina in coping with yet another Zoom meeting right after a long weekend. We appreciate you. We're absolutely honored to have a stellar roster of experts to lead our discussions over the next few hours and days. My many thanks to the panelists, to the moderators, and to our fantastic keynote speakers, Dr. Isaiah Pickens, New York State Chief Judge Janet DeFiore, and Professor Gary Young for sharing their brainpower, their experience, and their passion with us. My thanks also to the entire YJI team, and especially to Avery Irons and Alicia Gagnon. Their dedication and thoughtfulness in organizing this event already makes it a success. I am also grateful to Professor Dana Peterson, Michelle Ellis, Vince Dilio, Tony Galveo, and Kristen Conklin for all their help and thought partnership. Last, but in no way least, my thanks go to our partners at the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, SUNY Albany, and to the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group for their unwavering support. Exactly 1 year ago, as New York had become the American epicenter of the pandemic, in a virtual forum much like this one, the YJI brought together researchers, policymakers, community representatives, practitioners, funders, and advocates to answer one fundamental question: are the kids all right? And further, we asked, are all kids all right? As we centered our discussions on the pandemic's disparate impacts on historically marginalized populations, including youth of color, youth with behavioral health needs, LGBTQIA+ youth, youth with disabilities, and immigrant youth. We would like to share with you a few insights from that national cross-stakeholder conversation.
So the pandemic is not just a public health crisis, it's a racial and economic one. The people most impacted by this, our youth, our elderly, is because of the racial, health, and economic disparities that we have in this country.
There's not an equal distribution of this. So again, an encouragement to look individually at each family, look individually at each child, to really think about what the impact is. We don't want broad strokes because that does not really help us be prescriptive in terms of what families need.
We can't be like reactionary. We can't just talk about only the risk and not about prevention, like not about what foundation is needed to like help make a child whole.
High-speed internet access or having equipment is a basic right. You're realizing that folks can't communicate. They can't be part of this new civil rights movement because they simply don't have the materials they need, materials that should really be as basic as food and water.
Reform is never applied toward communities uniformly, and you can't expect the same impact on communities that have long histories of violence and oppression from the state.
I created a 3-person evaluation team to review the youth that were currently in detention at the time of the shutdown, so to speak, using these revised admission criteria to determine which youth may be released to alternatives to detention. And this resulted in a 95% of my detained population being released. And I want to point something out. To this day, not a single one of them have disrupted or reoffended. And that's extremely important because it begs the question, should I have allowed them in the first place?
Families are experiencing loss, and I think they haven't had time to grieve. And I think that that's going to be an issue going forward. There was a lot of people who lost their lives during this pandemic, and families are going to have to find a way to grieve, this process, because they weren't able to say goodbye to their loved ones.
One of the things we know is that when people belong, first of all, their capacity to resist trauma is greater. That is, the effect of an event is less likely to be traumatizing if you are in a space where you belong. And part of belonging is just that, is to be really seen. There's a South African word called sabalonu, and it's translated, I see you. It's also translated, the God in me sees the God in you. But for many young people, especially young people of color, they don't feel seen, so they don't have that network.
So we can be resilient, but let's not mistake at all that we are not hurt by the things that we go through. And I think sometimes resilience can be used in a way to mismanage the trauma and the punishment that these children are going through.
Part of what we need to be talking about in this conversation is that reforms can only go so far. We have to be ready for them. Our heart has to be ready for them.
This pandemic has shown us that changing our reliance on juvenile detention is possible.
In New York now, a year later, we dare to begin seeing an end to this pandemic, marked by increased access to the vaccine and by revisions to social isolation policies. We also dare to believe that the age-old calls for racial justice that echoed loudly in 2020 may have begun to resonate, or at least they did so in one courtroom in Minneapolis. All in all, we have reached what feels very much like a transitional, perhaps even transformative moment. In moments like this, the ancient Romans looked to the god Janus, who had one head looking forward and one head looking backward, for guidance. Janus's great power was to see both the past and the future, to see inward and outward, all at the same time. At moments of change, he took lessons from what he saw before and planned for tomorrow. As we emerge from our pandemic lives, what do we see in the future? Do we see a next normal for our schools, teaching children in new ways? Or do we see regression and exclusion from lost education? Do we see a better normal for our criminal legal system, which has found new ways to deliver justice? Or do we see old inequities replicating themselves? Do we see our youth whole, healthy in body and mind, at peace, civically engaged, ready and eager to learn? Or do we see our children, our teens, our young adults, contending with wounds exacerbated by the pandemic and caused by racism, ableism, and other isms that are endemic in our health, education, and justice systems? To prepare for this year's forum, we convened 3 groups of experts to help us prioritize what youth really needs in this transitional moment, in the immediate future, and permanently. 1 group focused on education, 1 on courts, and 1 on trauma and healing. We asked them, what questions should we be asking as we move beyond the pandemic? Who can help us look forward while looking backward? We're grateful to everyone who served on those panels. In a way, they were our Januses. Today's event, which you're about to see, is certainly made better by their insights and hard work. The rest of the work is really up to you, our audience. Your job today is to listen and watch, ask questions, and learn from what others show you. We're scholars, educators, community members, government officials, youth, and family representatives. We each have our own experiences of this pandemic, and we all have thoughts about what can or what should come next. But this event will work best if, like Janus, you look not only within yourself, but also outward to what others are showing you. If you reflect on what's behind us and help us craft a path forward. Perhaps a place to start is to try and imagine the world as it is experienced right now by our young people. To those of us with kiddos at home, we may have seen firsthand the toll the pandemic has taken on our teens' mental health, or the inevitable learning loss that came with the shift to online learning, especially for our kids with disabilities. But we don't need to reach for personal examples. Our young people's trauma, their viewpoint is painfully public. A year and a week ago, at age 17, Darnella Frazier showed us a video of what she saw during this pandemic. Walking to the corner store with her little cousin, they witnessed the murder of George Floyd, a Black man, by Derek Chauvin, a white police officer. And when Darnella shared that video, she showed us all something that we might not have seen otherwise, or worse, that we might have chosen not to see. As we look back to look forward, let us look within ourselves, but let us also always try to remember what others, what young people like Darnella are showing us. Right, and for those of you in the audience, when you first registered for the forum, we asked you to tell us what your most important support system was when you were in school. We've compiled your answers into a video, and we'll share that video with you in a moment. We've also prepared an interactive activity for you at this point, or at any time between now and the end of today's event. You can follow the link on the chat. And tell us in one word, and we ask you to stick to one word, what you're taking away from today's forum. Your contributions will be automatically added to a word cloud that we hope to share with you when we wrap things up, either today or later on. You can also see those instructions on the screen on how to participate in this activity. Before we move on to the panel discussions, as promised, we'll leave you with your answers to the registration question, and we'll follow that up with a brief break. Now would be a very good time to stretch, to grab a snack, to take a bio break, and to refuel for the panel discussion that will begin momentarily. Thank you very much.
you for joining.
Welcome back, everyone. We will now move on to what I'm sure will be an incredible panel discussion on education as a protective influence for vulnerable youth populations. Let me begin by introducing each of our panelists as well as our moderator. It is my pleasure to invite Jason Williams to share this virtual stage with us. Jason is a youth activist from Nassau County, New York, who helps enrich his community through a range of activities, doing everything from mentoring at-risk youth through local nonprofits to teaching coding to elementary school students. Welcome, Jason. We are also delighted to have Dr. Tracy Buenavista join us for this discussion. Tracy is a professor of Asian American Studies at the California State University at Northridge. She also serves as the co-principal investigator for the university's DREAM Center, Asian American Studies Pathways Project, and Ethnic Studies Education Pathways Project. Tracy is also a member of the advisory committee for the project Rebound Community. Her research uses critical race theory to examine how education, immigration, and carcerality shape the contemporary experiences of people of color in the United States. It is great to have you, Tracy, and thanks for the extra effort in joining us so early out there in California. We appreciate you. Next up is Dr. Tammy Ellis-Robinson, assistant professor within the divisions of special education and educational psychology and methodology here at the University at Albany. She has experience as a special education teacher in an urban high school and in theater education through the Arts Center of the Capital Region. Tammy is also the founder and executive director of Scribblers Magazine, Inc., a local nonprofit promoting literacy and self-expression. Welcome, Tammy. Rounding up our stellar panel is Jason Seals. Jason is University at Albany alumnus, Chair of Ethnic Studies and tenured professor at Merritt College. Apart from his role as an educator, Jason facilitates community workshops, professional development trainings, and he hosts the podcast, A Moment of Truth, which is available on Spotify and Buzzsprout. Thanks for joining us, Jason, and also special thanks for the early start from the West Coast. And to moderate the conversation, I'd like to invite to the virtual stage Dr. Joseph Tomassone. Dr. Tomassone is Acting Associate Commissioner for Youth Programs and Services for the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, the Division of Juvenile Justice Opportunities for Youth. He is responsible for the development and oversight of programs and services for youth in residential and community care. Joe is also the chief psychologist for the division, which has a central role developing mental health policy and programming in conjunction with the Bureau of Behavioral Health. Within this role, he was the principal author of the New York Model, which revised and reconceptualized the delivery of services to justice-involved youth throughout New York State. This model helped youth build skills to engage in behavioral self-regulation while working towards self-identified goals. Dr. Tomassone, thank you very, very much for being here. Take it away.
Thank you, Giza. We are very excited to continue this really important discussion, and I hope that we can certainly continue the energy and excitement level that Dr. Pickens set for us. He certainly set the bar high. So we have several rounds of questions for our panelists today. We're hoping to hear from their varied points of view and to continue the discussion. And then we'll have some time later for questions that have come in from the audience. So we have 3 rounds of questions that each of our panelists will be addressing. And the first question is, from each of your vantage points, how can we most effectively and supportively return students to high quality in-person education, especially students who have special education needs and students who have been completely disconnected for the past year? So let's turn this over first to Tammy, then we'll go through the rest of our panelists. Tammy.
Thank you. So the first piece of that question that I would focus upon is this, whether or not we're actually returning to high quality in-person education and how we define that high quality. There have been several scholars who throughout this year have talked about rethinking education and allowing the pandemic to be an opportunity for a restart, for a reboot, for really looking at some of those inequities that have existed within the system and considering how we might engage differently. Rebooting education through an expansive definition of what high quality, effective, and supportive in-person education for students receiving special education services and students who've been disconnected, as well as those who've been underserved by the system, even when engaged. Disparities among sociocultural groups, including based on ability, race, linguistic diversity, and gender, etc., have been reified in schools through practices such as grouping, pedagogy, assessment, and these have to be part of what we attend to in this return to high quality, effective, and supportive education. So by this, I mean, how might we become more effective and supportive as a community of educators, providers, parents, families, caregivers, individuals? We have to rethink what the purpose of education is in this society, that it's about, developing and eradicating a community of what has been ineffective for individuals and building up a new system that will really bring young people into the future as the leaders, as the individuals who are now going to engage these systems, taking a theoretical perspective and the applied experiences along the way to examine the good work that's done in schools already. So that's not to say that everything needs to be completely thrown out, but rather that we want to look at the innovative work that has addressed needs exacerbated by the pandemic and reboot education with attention to the practices. Things like inclusive practices and opportunities for least restrictive environments, where we redefine inclusivity so that it's not just about conforming to mandates, but expansively considering inclusive outcomes for students, that all students have the opportunity to self-determine those outcomes. Not letting those virtual or restrictive measures that were developed in the name of safety persist in the name of convenience to practitioners without better serving families. So again, looking at these examples that have existed within the current system and making sure that our return to highly effective and supportive is really examining a product and a process that is what we want to reify for really the future, using technology, equity-mindedness, so that we're not only engaging students to reach their preferred outcomes, but also to be critically and active members of the very communities we're building around them.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Jason, let's turn to you for your thoughts on the same question.
I'd like to start.
Jason Williams, start.
No problem. I'd like to start my response with the cliche, Rome wasn't built in a day. I think that it does need to be a slow process, especially considering that the pandemic happened so fast. You would rather want a slower process to reverse any effects, as well as consulting guidance counselors and school psychologists, because I believe that they're rather overlooked when it comes to issues like these. But guidance counselors are the first ones that students are supposed to go to in terms of, I guess, anything that a teacher wouldn't be able to handle in the student's eyes, or something maybe more emotionally. I think that it's because I know that for different areas, they feel differently about going back to school. I've spoke to neighborhoods and counties where they're all ready. They're like, I'm ready to get back into school. Everybody's ready, but they may not exactly be able to right now. Whereas I've been in other counties where they've been like, oh no, I don't want to go back to school. Not yet, nope, not in a building. So that's why I'd say leave it to the guidance counselors and school psychologists. But ultimately, at least for all the districts, I think a line of events where you kind of merge the lines of school and community, where you host school and community events, where it'd be a mix of free and low price consumables. Like if you have a large park, a nice barbecue would be nice. That way all the students and the teachers, you're all talking to each other. It's not so much of, oh, I haven't seen you in a year or two. You have a beard now, I don't know who you are. It's, hey, yeah, let's hang out. Get it more on a casual level, at least because in my neighborhood, when I was in kindergarten, my mom used to take me to bingo at my school. So that was always pretty interesting to go to. And you'd see teachers, principals, and it felt like a real community then. As well as I would say allow for both in school and virtual learning, just because once again, to accommodate both sides, people who really want to be with people who not only really want to be around other people, but those who more so need to be around other people, even for emotional support, or even just seeing friends. And then if you have anyone who, let's say, if you just don't even really like your school, if you're a kid who moves a lot, then you might want to stay at home and do virtual, just because, you may not like making friendships because you're always moving. Just different aspects to think of it. But ultimately, I think guidance counselors and school psychologists have more of an input, schools everywhere, at least on reopening.
Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate your perspective. Moving on now to Tracy. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I'm right there with my colleagues. I think what I'm hearing is, the question of what are we returning to? right? And second is this idea of what we would like to return to is more community-based, right? This question is really hard to answer precisely because of what Tammy highlighted, which is that it presumes that the in-person education that students experienced prior to COVID school closures was actually high quality. And I think what the pandemic actually revealed was how very broken schooling has been for students, especially for our at promise and opportunity youth. So I think the most effective way to return to schools is to actually fundamentally shift away from the way that schooling's been done. So from like an academic standpoint, which, I would maybe even consider de-emphasizing, right? Schools have always been extremely focused on standardized testing, but we've seen the dismantling of such testing and everyone from parents and teachers questioning what tests even measure, right? It means shifting from like one size curriculum to one that's more student-centered and collaborative, because students have really lost out on that social engagement. And so how can we design education where it actually requires that we team build, right? And we've been advocating for smaller class sizes and lower student to teacher ratios for a long time, but it's only now that we've been able to make some gains in that area because of social distancing policies, right? And so, these are things that the pandemic has revealed that we can do, even though I think historically it's been real resistance trying to do those things. But echoing Jason from a socio-emotional perspective, I think in order to support a return to in-person learning, we really have to acknowledge that we have suffered, as Isaiah Pickens said earlier, right, a collective trauma. So for example, like in districts that serve primarily students of color, we have to really consider the higher likelihood that not only the students' families, but the teachers have often literally been directly impacted by COVID. Like in many instances, we've experienced loss, right? Like actual like family loss. And so how do schools handle that, right? Support students and teachers in that regard. And we don't quite fully understand the complete effects that like social isolation or the inconsistent sort of structures of schooling, or again, like this personal trauma that it's had on students and teachers. So I think we have to take an approach that really centers the needs of students who've been most vulnerable in this pandemic, including trying to figure out how to reach students who already are predicted to be the least likely to return, like students with special needs, students who are opportunity youth, students in the foster care system, right? And this translates, again, as was said in the keynote, we need to take like a trauma-informed approach, healing-centered approach to not only teaching, but I think also counseling and how administrators lead schools. And I think that's really key, right, is how the educational leaders actually bring all the different educational constituents together in such a way that it's not like neoliberal. It's not about getting kids back in school so parents can go back to work. Right? It's about getting kids back in school because that's just the right thing to do, right? So our educational leaders trying to guarantee like, a basic needs approach. Are we providing counselors, social workers, on-site health professionals? Are schools sanitary? Are we providing food for everybody, right? Regardless of having to provide some income like verification, right? I think schools have to essentially reimagine, again, like I said earlier, in-person learning as not solely academic. We actually have to check in with students and we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to use class time to actually check in, right? To actually provide a space, the mechanisms, and the resources for students to articulate what their needs are. Like, are we willing to use our class time to do that? And, I think that's where we can kind of shift the conversation.
Thank you very much. We certainly have a lot of possibilities moving forward. We'll see if we have the wisdom to learn from the past year. Lastly, on this question, Jason, SEALs, what are your thoughts?
Give thanks. I really appreciate being here. This is a really difficult question, and I think it's difficult because there's a history around education for African people, indigenous people, Latinx people, Asian people in this country that has essentially excluded us from quality education. And so for me, when you say high quality education, what I'm thinking, has that ever existed? I think Tammy made a point that there are good and progressive things happening, but historically, and even in the modern state, there's always been this struggle for quality education. And I think there's been a space where we can exist, but in that existence, we have been attacked and harmed. I think about someone, as myself, as a parent that had a 6-year-old in a private school. And in this private school, what was always the focus was everything outside of his academics. I had to remove him out of that school. And so when I think about putting him back in the school, to be honest, my child excelled being at home, right? But knowing that he's in a space where he has an educator as a parent, I understand that that's not everyone's reality. So it's really important for us to really think about what is needed. We need to understand the historical landscape of what education has been, right? And I think we need to have some honest, moments of coming to the reality that, students haven't been the problem. It's been the system of education that's been the problem. So for me, I would love to see teachers, staff, and administrators begin to adopt a form of cultural humility. So Dr. Melody Turvalon talks about cultural humility. I would love for them to embrace this thing of a personal, lifelong commitment to self-evaluation. Right. So I think before we even allow students back into these educational spaces, I think there needs to be time just for staff, teachers, and administrators to build a space to think about, to explore, to unpack, to transform themselves, right? So they aren't harming our children, harming our babies, right? Because I think there's more criminalization right now. More anti-Blackness, more anti-Asian hate, more so now than ever. So are people digesting this, where it's become a more part of their psyche? And how is that going to come out in instruction? How is that going to come out in a space where it's supposed to grow your whole self, right? So I think it's really important that and they think about that process, that the institution is accountable in that way. I think it's really important that if we're going to talk about our children, what they need, let's think about the whole child. So I think there's a skill part that's important to think about, but also think this space should be about healing and preparation for their social, political experience moving beyond that space. What do our children want and need? And I would say this. I think it's really important that parents, community members, students are part of the conversation of curating what schools should look like moving forward. It should not happen in isolation with just, the quote unquote educational experts. The experts are the students. They know what they've been experiencing for the past year and a half. The parents have a good idea. Bring them into the conversation. And I think when we have a collaborative process, as Tracy and Tammy brought up, this is going to allow us to have a different experience. And so I think that's a starting place.
Thank you very much, Jason. Appreciate that, and appreciate all of you touching on what clearly is an issue, which is expanding the context of this discussion and not simply focusing on education as a check mark or a score on a test. And so really appreciate all the thoughts on that. The second question in this round of questions is, we now have a cohort of students who have experienced collective trauma. How do schools offer support and proactively guard against a reliance on punitive and exclusionary discipline when issues do arise? And how can these efforts create and strengthen partnerships with caregivers. So for this round, we'd like to start with Tracy.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to, right on what Jason said. I think we're both coming from the perspective of ethnic studies educators, and I think our entire field or discipline has always been about questioning education as we know it, right? I want to answer this question as, I want to contextualize how I'm answering this question. So I'm someone who directly works with undocumented youth, systems impacted youth. And I want to state that, exactly what Jason said, schools have a really long way to go in terms of dismantling our traditionally carceral approach to education, right? We engage carceral practices to deal with students. We don't work with students, we deal with students, right? And it's because we live in a carceral society. So everything we do from parenting to resolving personal conflict with loved ones to just even working with students, it often centers on the idea of punishment, containment, control, right? And schools are absolutely no exception. And so we also know that when basic needs aren't met, this is what sets up the conditions for trauma to manifest and thrive in schools, right? And I think everyone involved in schools, including students and families, all the way to the educators, like we have to actually collectively agree on the possibility that students have experienced collective trauma. I'm not sure everyone is ready to actually do that. I think, there's been a particular disregard that students have even experienced in the shift from in-person to online to then in-person learning. And it didn't often center like what students wanted or needed, and how even that in and of itself caused harm, right? So I think if there's a collective acceptance of COVID conditions as trauma-inducing, then we can reckon with the harm like actually conditioned by COVID, right? I think in terms of moving away from punitive discipline, we can take a transformative justice approach. So there's restorative justice, there's transformative justice, and there are practitioners in the community who can come and help schools do this. But in my experience, at the core of TJ or RJ, right, it's the need to start with oneself, right? So where do my immediate inclinations for punitive discipline come from? How are my own traumas manifesting? How do the policies and procedures that I'm expected to follow actually guide me towards punishment instead of away from it? Right? I think these are questions that we have to like ask ourselves, like just personally, right? And then like as an educator, how can I like develop a check-in and a check-out system like before and after school? Because we need that, right? Like we need to, as education professionals, we need to be able to disconnect from our jobs sometimes. And in this context, that's been really difficult. I mean, even right now, I'm doing this panel, my child is getting ready for school right in front of me, right? And I think, again, I brought it up earlier, I think administrators, we have to think about how are my school, am I providing not only my students with wellness resources, but am I also supporting my teachers who are coming in experiencing complex and vicarious forms of trauma, right? From being what some of my colleagues are calling containers of care, right? Like educators literally are containers of care. We have to realize that in this pandemic context, it's been a lot. So how are we supporting ourselves and sort of, navigating all of this? And I think that our present moment has like, for one of the first times in history, provided us like an actual real opportunity to engage in abolitionist practices. I think as someone who's self-identified as an abolitionist, I'm like, finally, right? Like we find students and educators, like they're actually questioning where school funding like goes to, right? Instead, like they're wondering, why is funding going towards school resource officers and not counselors and social workers, right? Like students and family are finally like recognizing their right to ethnic studies, culturally responsive curriculum, right? Community responsive wellness programming. Like they're actually imagining that school should be responsible for that. And I think that schools can use what I call a reinvigorated engagement, because not that they've never been engaged, they've just not been asked, right? So how can schools use this reinvigorated engagement by students and families to actually leverage for resources for basic needs, right? I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, so really important point that, you know, stress and crisis expose vulnerabilities, but also create incredible opportunities. So again, it begs the question of where we're headed from here in terms of those opportunities. Next on this question, we'd like to hear from Jason Williams.
I would just like to say that as far as collective trauma goes, I think that the best way that anyone can really help the students is by realizing that we're all in one of the same. Those students that you're talking to, they're just young adults. They're gonna turn into you eventually. So I would probably, at least for me, I've always felt that the easiest way to talk to somebody is to put yourself in their shoes and think about what you would want to hear. Because kids, I feel like as time goes on, kids have more responsibilities at younger ages. But with technology, we're able to handle it. But I feel like it may not be as recognized or even like the intellect level of the youth. So like a youth that feels like if you're at home all day, once you leave school and you're just on Google and Wikipedia all day, you're going to learn a lot of knowledge. So at some point you're going to feel, hey, I want some respect too. You're not the only smart person just because you can reach the books on the top shelf. They're going to want some respect too. So I just feel like an open dialogue, not only with teachers, but anyone. I mean, I used to talk to janitors from my school, security guards, principal, anyone who would say hi, they got a hi back. So I think just being there, some students don't even need nothing but a, hey, how you doing? Once again, from a personal experience in high school, after the afternoon announcements, my principal would say, after the morning announcements, my principal would say, if nobody's told you this today, I love you. And that was due to all the events that had occurred in my town throughout all the years in collective trauma. Something else that we had that I feel most schools don't have, which was rather effective, was we had a team center, which was, it was a safe space rather for any student to go to. So if you got in an argument with a teacher and you got kicked out the class, you could go there if you didn't want to go to the principal's office. And they would talk, they had, that's where the school psychologist was. They had a therapist there to talk to. And it was a judgment-free zone. You could go there, play board games, and, you know, just relax. The way that I like to view it is students pretty much live at school because they're there for the half of their day that they're awake for. So it's like, they're kind of like, hey, I have to be here. Can I at least have fun? Like you can teach them whatever. They just want to have fun at the end of the day. It's all about how you present the information. And also making sure that it's I guess feels collaborative with the students as well. And because like, I feel like even as educators and teachers, you may come to options yourselves like, hey, should I teach them, let's say, should I show them a video or should I show them slides? And you may be deciding, but then like they may be over there like, hey, I probably want the slides today. Versus they're like, yeah, I don't want the video. And it's just little things. I feel like they just more so want, kids just want someplace to go where they're like, hey, if I can't talk to my parents, can I talk to a teacher? If I can't talk to my teacher, can I talk to a janitor? Can I talk to somebody? They just need to know that somebody cares about them, which brings me up to friendship circles or circles of intimacy. They go by several names. It would be where you draw a large circle and you draw a circle within it, layering, and you put yourself in the center, and outside you put everyone who's closest to you as to everyone who's least close to you, but you can still go to, just so that you can put your own life into perspective. And it's a real eye opener.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate the thought that we really shouldn't miss an opportunity to connect with each other and to be compassionate and empathic with each other. Oh, I hope I didn't cut Jason off. Next on this question, we have Tammy.
Thank you. So listening to both what Tracy and Jason talked about, and then thinking of what I was considering around this question, just really made me tone in on who we're educating, right? The education process, and when I think about why I went in initially to teaching, is about building the future with young people, bringing information to young people. It's not about the content. We're not teaching stuff. We're teaching individuals, and that need or that desire to be engaged and to have fun and for it to be meaningful really is at the very center of the work. But not only for K-12, the young people, but also as I think about my work working with new educators, pre-service educators, and we work with undergraduates who are beginning that foray into becoming educators. We work with teachers in their master's programs who are out doing student teaching and internships, and we work in professional development with seasoned teachers. And part of that has, prior to pandemic, include acknowledging the effects of trauma. Recently, there have been more mandates around social emotional learning as part of the curricula in schools. And I think this gives us an opportunity to integrate it more holistically when we recognize that collective experience, that it's broader, it's a grander scale, but it's still a fine-tuned and fine-grained skill set and focus to examine the relationships that we build between and among people through practices that, like our keynotes brought up to us, sees the context before the consequence and recognizes that we're all sort of part of creating and building that context in schools. Schools are not simply a space where we're dealing with students. We together create the community, the culture, and our practices need to be aligned with our ethic of care and our ideals. You spoke about transformation, Tracy, and transformative practices, and that is really what the purpose and hopefully the product of our education is. It's that transformation, and it's that passage from one generation to the next of skills and of hopefully agency to engage in criticality around what's happening in society and what's happening in their education, and that criticality is something we want to develop and should exist all along the way so that they can say no to the slides, yes to the video, you know what, let's all go march now, or whatever else the decision is that's going to be made in that space. Along that way, and a big word or a big phrase that has come up and then been questioned in my specific work has been looking at mindfulness and this idea of mindfulness, right? And instilling mindfulness as a tool, and then remembering and in working with pre-service educators and others to think about mindfulness of what, right? What are we being mindful of is what's key, not just floating around and thinking that it's this new practice, but that we're being mindful of something. And what that is of who and where students and families are coming from, their values, their needs as a whole person, and then your own needs as a practitioner and how they intersect. And that is really where we need to go when we consider, what are going to be consequences for different behaviors, both our own and theirs, and how we can make those be about the communicative importance of those behaviors in interacting with one another, and recognizing that our minds, so mindful that our minds are full of thought patterns that are a very real part of our experience, and that those thought patterns go back to a lot of the things that these panelists have talked about historically, collective trauma based on really things that happen in society, that have happened historically in society, that students are seeing in the news, that are happening in their neighborhoods, and that these patterns of thought are very real experiences that we cannot deny and that have to be brought into that context in considering practices.
Thank you, Tammy. And then again, last on this question is Jason Seals.
So I think for me, I would love for us to acknowledge how racism creates a certain type of experience and environment for our students and what they're holding. So when we talk about conflict, to me, conflict is inevitable, right? Regardless of the environment. But I think coming into school environments, I think our children are holding a lot of anxiety, a lot of pain, and even like the ideas of being dehumanized. And I think when you carry those things and you compound them with just everyday life stressors, maybe even sometimes your struggles in school, maybe you don't have the skill set to be able to engage in certain relationship dynamics, there's going to be conflict. Conflict is so normal and we should normalize it. But I think we also have to normalize it that a lot of our students have been criminalized through conflict, that they've been pushed out because of conflict. That all said, I think it's really important that we not harm our children more, right? So when I think about the video that was shown earlier, I saw a lot of people saying it was powerful. I think it made me extremely sad that those children were being used as a tool to teach white students about their privilege. That's what pained me. And so to that point, I think that our teachers need to really understand not to use our children as opportunities to learn for themselves. I think learning can happen simultaneously, but not at the expense of our children. And so I would love to see there be a community of practice that's developed at every institutional, environment where that community of practice is based in love, learning, and belonging. And when you do that, I think when you center love, you center humanity. And the greatest gift that teachers, staff, and administrators can offer is a place that acknowledges the humanity of our children. Just acknowledge the humanity. Like, I see you. Jason spoke to that earlier. It's like, I see you. So many times our children are invisible. So when conflict happens, that's the only time that they're often seen. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, it's the only time they're seen. And so acknowledging in that moment, what behavior are you communicating? What do I need to see and hear and understand? Not, punitive, kick you out, expel you, not that. It's like, what do you need? As a parent, and this is my reference point, like I was an educator for years before I became a parent, but a parent has made me more thoughtful because when my child does something, I have to say, hold on, let me slow up and let me think about what is going on here. What does he need from me? And a lot of times it's being present with him and him knowing that even in the moment where he knows he's done something wrong, that I still love him. My son taught me that because a lot of times he'll get in trouble and after he'll be like, can I have a hug? And so how do we create a space where you can actually have a conflict, maybe do something that maybe causes harm, but you're still acknowledged as human and given loved. And then you can learn. You're more likely to learn from that if you know you're still accepted, still received, still embraced. So I would love to see community of practices where we normalize conflict, build relationships. The relationship piece is going to be so big. Like, I think we have often said we have to build relationships. Like we talk about it like we have to build relationships, but we have to really center relationship building. Meet parents, meet fictive kin, meet, family friends, meet the basketball coach, meet the people that's really important. Like I do an exercise with teachers and educators and folks in the community where I talk to them about, what are their values? What are the things that are most important to them? And then I usually say to them, with the children that you work with, the student that you work with, do you know their top 10 values? And if you don't know their values, then how can you really say you know them? And that requires us as educators, as folks that are thoughtful about the environments we're attempting to curate, is to integrate into the curriculum spaces to truly, truly learn about each other. Because we get so caught up on them knowing this skill set, them knowing that skill set, which plays a part. But what I've learned through my research and what I've seen is that our children learn better when there are safe and supportive communities. When you have that first, everything else follows. So the community practice to me is the starting place.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you all. Really powerful thoughts on how, and really important lessons for the culture at large, in addition to education as a part of it. How do we stay connected and honor each other's humanity, even when we disagree, completely and totally? How do we stay connected? Really important ideas, and thank you all. We have another question for all of our panelists to consider. The question is, we've heard from education colleagues that when the pandemic started, some schools' previous work to integrate restorative practices and communities of care enabled them to support youth and families more seamlessly during the pandemic. For schools now wanting to begin or to deepen this work as more students return to in-person learning, how do they start and what can they do? So let's go first to Jason Seals.
This is a tough question, but I would say I would love to see there be what Jason brought up earlier, which is really deepening relationships through getting into the community. I think there's an opportunity to get into the community and really begin to build a relationship, begin to establish who are the stakeholders, think about ways to collaborate together. I think moving outside of the school itself allows for there to be a different context. And so if you did, a gathering at a park and you did, some relationship building activities, you actually said, okay, you go from, playing some games together where you're getting to know each other to, maybe small dyads where people are talking about, their personal experience during COVID, to then maybe small group sessions, to then talking about, well, what should school look like? Just as a collective discussion, maybe have a scribe to take notes and then say, well, how does parents, support and be part of this educational process? Well, what do parents need or what do students need? So having these like dialogues where people can talk and kind of flesh out ideas, I think would be extremely important, because I think what is often missing is just that, this opportunity to create together, to build together. And so I think really for me, we want to deepen the work by acknowledging that we've fallen short and be willing to explore new ways of being together and creating learning environments. And that might mean something that's totally different than what exists right now. I think we should be open to that. And I think we should be open to, spaces where we can have team teaching, where we can have more people inside the classroom, smaller classrooms. This also might mean that, there's a huge gap, right, between schools that are in urban communities and schools in affluent communities. It's like $1 billion gap. We have to acknowledge that. We have to think about ways that we factor that in, but not allow that to also be the reality of why our young people aren't getting the best, right? And our schools are more heavily segregated, even more so before Brown versus Board of Education. So that means that we have to ensure that who are the people that's in front of them? right? How do we integrate culture, that culture acknowledges their humanity, and culture not just being something that is just opposed to whiteness, but allow their culture to facilitate a healing process and a learning process. Because for me, I think about Gil Scott-Heron had a song years ago called "Who's Going to Pay Reparations on My Soul?" And I'm wondering, how are schools going to be a space to do just that? Pay reparations in the form of preparation, in the form of healing, in the form of equity. Those to me are really good starting points. And I mentioned the work of Dr. Melanie Turvalon around cultural humility. You know, the work that has to happen around self-reflection evaluation is really important, but also the institutions. How does, you know, the functionality of schools work in a way that is harmful? How do we change that so there is a different power dynamic, and that power dynamic isn't this traditional structure, but maybe it's a collaboration between, you know, students and teachers and parents. And so we have to factor those things in. I would start there.
Thank you, Jason. Next, we'll hear from Tammy.
I really have to say that this idea of expansive collective defining of what the purpose of education will be and how schools will look, as sort of a theme that I've heard come through my colleagues' comments, really needs to be how the conversation takes hold. Within the context of the pandemic, holistically, community development and integration of practices to build relationships with families, to deepen relationships with students, has occurred in, you know, not necessarily systemic ways, but more individually, as educators and practitioners recognized that, well, wait a minute, I am the lifeline, I am the connector here, and that type of connecting can continue, especially if we do a little bit of asset mapping, looking at, you know, okay, where did it work? Who was able to make this happen? How did they make it happen in ways that maybe step outside of practices that have been traditional and accepted and even mandated, and then looking at the data around these other practices and finding ways that we might integrate systems, or there might be coordination between those communities where the resources are greater. There's a huge difference in what we're talking about here with the return to school and the extending of these type of communities of care. There are schools that have been, you know, they've been in school all year, students K through 8 all day long, and there's schools where nobody has been in person, and just that disparity alone is indicative of the great difference in resources that we need to consider within these communities, that we can map a new way of looking at this if we are honest about the disparity of resources, the resource of time, the resource of connection, the resource of enough people, the resource of enough grace. We spent some time, so we did some work talking to special educators at different points throughout this pandemic about their practices, about their deepening of relationships, what has worked, what hasn't worked with them. And you know, we've got a lot of data around that, but at the end of the day, there are 3 L's that kind of lean forward there, and that was leaning in to those relationships and recognizing all stakeholders, listening, and learning, and recognizing that something like that criticality we mentioned earlier, and that historical reference and framework of not being a part of the plan is how we can come back and ensure that the communities of care that have been successful are at the forefront, are what's brought to the center of education practices, and that some of those things that have indeed been harmful can be named, pointed at, and pushed, you know, to the sides, and reified and altered in ways that will better serve students. Different types of assessment, different types of mastery level learning. You know, do we need there to be grade levels, or can it just be mastery of particular skills and contexts and collaboration and social skills being part of what's also within the curriculum and emphasized within the curriculum.
Thank you, Tammy. Jason Williams, what are your thoughts?
I would just like to say that I love the idea of rethinking educational systems as a whole, because I've always felt that from the basis they are faulty, not completely, each to their own, but at least from my perspective, I grew up on Long Island. My high school was, I would say, 50% Black, 50% Latinx. That's pretty much the whole split. I didn't, even though I didn't meet my first white friend until I started working. At 16, my first Caucasian friend was a 33-year-old man. So it's like, you know, you see TV and social media and all these things, but it's like, what is the reality of it? So even like coming from my school, even with there still being no white people, there were still race riots. We still had one my year, we still had some in my older brother's year. The tensions still continue, but I wouldn't say that it gets any easier. You have to make schools an actual community of care if that's what they're meant to be. Because at least for me, I think it's rather hypocritical that I consider myself a lifelong learner, but I'm not going to be in school for all my life. I don't want lifelong debt. I'm a lifelong learner, but there's other ways to obtain knowledge. I still go to a library. I still look up stuff on Google, but these aren't necessarily ways that are valued and awarded with credentials. So it's rather what you do with that information. So at least for me, one of my things with school has always been there needs to be at least something that is like, you shouldn't have to leave high school with a high school diploma and have no job available, or just have like some basic job available. You should be able to at least do at least one trade or something that you can get into immediately that can lead you to a brighter pathway. Even if that means taking a psychology 101 course with students and parents, I think that alone would do tremendous work. At least then, because a lot of parents weren't able to go to school, so a lot of their students don't go to, a lot of their children don't go to school. At least then they can both have a sense of who humans are, what we're kind of supposed to be doing. Because I feel like that's what really opened at least my mind to a lot more of how we're all just one. We're all the same. It's just what we go through, what we look like, how we experience life that determines who we are and how we live our life ultimately. So I think that ultimately making schools not just seen as a place for young people, but more so as a place for those who want to learn with a broader array of topics would probably work out a lot better. A broader range of topics so that it could be some basic things like maybe just only the first year college classes that you take, I mean, only 100 level classes, because my school had a program where we took college classes on the weekends and we went to high school during the weekdays. And from then I was like, yeah, I'm ready for college. I dusted off my hands. I was like, yeah, I'm ready. But that was like a nice little taste of what's to come. So it's almost like you get to know what's coming. That as well as like, and I've heard mainly mainly older people I've heard say this about how when they were in school, they've had actual courses about like taxes, how to do your taxes, how to sell a house, how to start a basic business, maybe even how to build a house, because that still blows my mind that people were building houses by hand. And that's something that I feel like not many people realize that can still be done today, that too many people are like, no, I got to hire a professional for that. No way I could do that. It's like, yeah, you just got to learn. It takes a little time, but patience is key. And that's my part on that question.
Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate your perspective on everything and particularly on learning. Thank you for that. Last on this question is Tracy.
Sorry, my mute button was acting funny. So, you know, This question was, when I first read this question, I was excited, right? Because on one hand, we're like, finally, schools are open to trying to engage with like these restorative practices that we know for decades have worked, right? And because of the pandemic, they finally had an opportunity to really see meaningfully like that these approaches can be successful. But then at the same time, what I, as well as a lot of my colleagues experienced, are schools and school districts just sort of calling us up and saying, hey, can you do like a PD on this and everything, like, how can you like package this, for my district? Like I was asked, for example, to conduct a PD on critical race theory to literally 1,000 people in LAUSD. And I said, I'm not going to do that. Right? Like, I'm not going to do that because I already know, just in terms of the environment you're bringing me into to do this work, it's not going to be a room full of engaged individuals, right? Which is sort of the absolutely worst way to learn something like CRT, right? So education is really funny because when we find something that works, our tendency is really to try and, scale it up, package it, commodify it. People like create organizations to get paid for like doing it, which is not, I'm not going to hate on that. But in doing so, oftentimes what happens is it loses some of its original intent or like impact potential. I think for a lot of people in this, virtual room, I think we could see that being done with trauma-informed approaches, healing-centered engagement, right? Like these things are like now buzzwords, whereas for many people, this is what we've been doing for decades, right? And so I think, to be honest, for schools that really want to more meaningfully engage in like restorative practices, the best place to start is what all my colleagues have been saying, right, is consult with the students and the families first. Like I wholeheartedly believe that a community of care approach, it has to be contextual, it has to be localized. Like if you ask students and families what's broken, they'll usually also have an answer to how to fix it too, right? I know that like in my community, when a lot of our undocumented parents were losing jobs because of COVID, it was their youth that actually, approached us to start a mutual aid fund, right? To go to provide like money, rent money, food money to undocumented families who were not even necessarily connected to schools, right? And so, they saw this issue, but they also simultaneously came up with a solution. And then even now, like we just ended May, which, is, all Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Heritage Month, right? And we know that there's been all these widely publicized hate incidences. And we also know that APITA families are not going to send their kids back to school. Like they don't feel the schools are safe for their kids because it's actually schools where they first experience racism, right? And then at the same time, I have not heard one school leader or ask an APITA student or family member or even an educator, like, how can we best re-engage like APITA students so that they'll feel safe, right? Like I haven't even heard anybody attempt to have that kind of conversation with us, right? And so I think that, again, like if we want to engage in restorative practices, we have to believe that communities of color that have a community cultural wealth, right? That they can draw on, like we draw on it to like address our basic needs, issues of conflict, right? Health issues. But it's not often that schools actually, one, ask us, right? What are your community healing practices? Or even if they do know it, it's not often that they respect them, right? And so I think, again, if schools want to integrate like more community-centered practices, it's what Jason said earlier, this has to be like a multi-year plan, right? We have to develop like practices that are place-based, It's time for school. Okay, baby. It has to be place-based. It can't be like I said earlier, a one-off professional development, right? It has to be like this entire paradigm shift in the school culture where community is actually deemed important, right? And I think even then when we do, and then, it's really easy to say, well, let's engage the community, right? Let's engage the community. But we also have to realize that's literally not easy. Parents are working, right? They're working multiple jobs. Most of the school activities that we do are to the convenience of the educators facilitating those spaces, and that's not always convenient for families, right? So can they be held at night? Are they going to be provided interpreters, translators, etc.? Are they going to rely on, again, the people who have been doing this for years, but not only rely on them for their knowledge, are they going to compensate them, right? May was really interesting. Again, it was a PETA Heritage Month, and I got a lot of asks to do all these things on anti-PETA hate, how to better, serve PETA students at schools. And I did most of them, right? And fortunately, I think people saw that it was a lot of labor and people offered what they could. But, it also amazed me the number of requests where it was almost expected, that's my job, right? To basically teach you because of your unwillingness to actually invest and engage in these questions on a more sort of everyday basis, right? So, okay, I'll stop there. But yeah, I'm just with what everyone has to say today. It's all the questions, all the responses to the questions, I think, is just making me think more deeply about, can we do this? Right? Can we do this? How are we going to do this?
Well, I like the point about, are we just going to check boxes or are we actually going to do the work? And that's a really important distinction. And I love how you were able to demonstrate with your daughter that, when you have a loving and trusting relationship, people will tell you what they need, and then you have an opportunity to meet their needs. So it was beautiful to witness. So we're now going to shift to some individual questions for folks. Each of our panelists has a particular question for them. And so the first one is going to go to Tammy. Tammy, the pandemic's impact on teachers and the entry rate into the profession has been dire. As we're learning the lessons from 2020 and thinking beyond it, how do we support teachers in these upcoming months, and how do we reckon as a nation with our treatment of and our expectations for teachers?
Thank you. So this question speaks to work we're doing to think about the teaching pipeline as it begins in K-12 schools, right? Our teachers are experiencing the very same education that we're talking about, and have experienced the very same education that we're talking about making changes and adjustments to. The education profession was experiencing shortages of people entering the field pre-pandemic, and special education in particular has always had this difficulty with attracting and retaining professionals to stay in the field. Stress and uncertainty during the pandemic really highlighted the essentiality of teachers and other education professionals, not only in education as an end game product for students, but as facilitators of the development, growth, the discovery, and arbiters of engagement to serve families in that way and communities daily, not childcare, not just keeping the children in a safe space, but helping children grow and knowing that they're developing the future resource that children are. And knowing your child is engaged, growing, interacting is a key component to the development of social emotional learning, identity, personhood, self-determination of plans for the future that we need kids to develop. So teachers were responsible and have been responsible in a large part, though not alone, for all of these within the community. And sometimes, where they have this great responsibility may feel scapegoated when things go awry. And we want teachers to feel empowered to bring the knowledge that they have developed as they've gotten to know their students, as they've looked at what works and what doesn't work, and to bring that to these rebuilding and re-envisionings of our education system. They already were facing increased accountability measures with APPR, national standards, tightening and extending of what's required for certification, and the assessments that they need to do. And this has brought a tone of sort of blame and punitive measures for accountability to teachers. And that really belies the passion that we want to build, that idea of, being the builders of an ethic of care in this development of a sense of community for the development of our young people, for the to decide to become part of that educator workforce. We've seen this particularly heightened with students who have been more often marginalized and underserved by communities. So we see that, there's very little representation, for example, of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color among teaching professions. And so where does that come from? And part of it comes from the way that we, from the K-12 up, begin our work to help develop that pathway for teachers. Alternative pathways to certification, increased opportunities for apprenticeship at young ages that extends from middle school to high school. These processes that include feedback that is constructive for teachers along that path, more of an opportunity to develop and build their skill set and bring what they're learning to a hopefully enlightened and new space in education where they're facilitating this development of relationships and expertise among all, where they are learning how to engage with their students in ways that respect them, like Jason talked about. Teacher expertise and responsiveness of a supported workforce for shared resources requires that there be lines of communication and a development of support so that teachers are being really nurtured in the same way that we want our children to be nurtured. And if our teachers are nurtured, they will have the space and the support to also impart and nurture our students.
Thank you, Tammy. Really important holistic approach. Again, I think some of the themes that are reverberating are really about the care and compassion that we're willing to show each other in order to heal all of our systems, and particularly the education system, which I think really had a spotlight shown upon it through the stressors of the pandemic. Thank you for your thoughts. Our next question is for Tracy. Tracy, your work grounds applied critical race theory as a pipeline to supporting better educational outcomes for Asian students and other students of color, and reducing harms like pushout. Can you break down a lay definition of critical race theory and how its application can move us forward as we think beyond 2020?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Right now, there's like a ton of misinformation on CRT out there because there's all these anti-CRT bills that we hear in various states. And, most folks who are opposed to it have not really seriously engaged with the decades of scholarship on CRT. And even for myself, it's not even that old of a framework. So like someone like me who I'm still continuing to learn about CRT's utility, its limitations, right? Because people are still theorizing it, right? But the way that I like to explain CRT to my own students is it's essentially a lens. It's like glasses that you put on to look at any kind of issue, whether it's like a social issue, a political issue, an economic issue. I mean, I've had students use CRT to address the relationship problems that they've had, right? And I think with any approaches to like problem solving, CRT, you come in with assumptions, right? So for CRT folks, we are guided by what we call tenets or principles, right? These are assumptions that we hold to be true. So for example, a primary tenet of CRT is that race and racism is what we call endemic to US society. It's everywhere. It influences all American institutions. And we also, have found that the law is designed and redesigned to really perpetuate white supremacy, right? So these are things that these are assumptions we start with when we're like looking at issues, right? So if we were to take this CRT lens and then look again at the impact of COVID-19 in schools, like CRT essentially guides us to ask questions about race. So how are students of color disproportionately affected by COVID-induced school closures, right? How are issues of burnout that I think Tammy is alluding to exacerbated for teachers of color, especially those, again, who are containers of care and who are working in schools that primarily serve students of color. I think perhaps the most familiar CRT-based concept that people might not even realize is CRT-based, that they've adopted kind of like into daily thinking, is Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality, right? That's a CRT-based concept. And it's, again, it's that idea that people can be multiply minoritized, right? And as a result, experience racism differently. So the type of racism I experience as a Pinay or Filipina identified person is going to be completely different than that of Jason, you know, and so we have to consider how racism is experienced differently when it comes to sort of problem solving. I think like for students or even people of color with disabilities, like how might, for example, the return to school differently impact students and educators of color with like autoimmune diseases or conditions, right? Like these are the kinds of questions that CRT like guides us to ask, right? And I don't think those are questions that a lot of people like ask. I think it's what Jason referred to earlier. Can we just talk about the obvious, which is racism, like the racism that is schooling, right? But for me, I think in terms of how the application of CRT can move us forward, it's useful because CRT isn't also just about analysis. It's not just about framing. There is an explicit commitment to social justice. It's one of the only theories that actually emphasizes praxis, like what we do with theory, how we enact theory, right? So CRT isn't just about recognizing injustices, it's actually developing mechanisms to address them. And so I think that's where, you know, a lot of people sort of stop. They learn about CRT, they have the analysis, but the praxis is not necessarily developed, right? And I think that's where we could sort of use CRT to move us in the future. And so, one of the really central parts about a CRT praxis is that it has us rely on the experiences of the very people who have embodied injustice, right? And I really mean embodied injustice, like they have felt it, right? So a CRT praxis is really people-centered, right? But not just any people, it's really the people who are often positioned in the margins and not relied upon to do the problem solving, right? It's providing folks who have been, you know, again, on the short end of the stick when it comes to equity, right? To have a space to come up with how we can reimagine life to be better, right? Like for our communities. And I think it's been sort of said that throughout, if we were to take a CRT approach to sort of addressing school reopening, right, that would mean like thinking with the most vulnerable students in mind first, right? As like an effort to be like inclusive of students with complex needs, right? And then scaling up our work, right, to serve the general masses. And I think that's opposite of what typically happens in education, right? The traditional approach is the low-hanging fruit approach, right? Let's address the masses so people have buy-in, right? And then we'll just deal with the complicated cases on a case-by-case basis. But I think CRT would actually guide us to do the exact opposite.
Really important thoughts. And again, I keep coming back every time you've spoken in the last few minutes. It reminds me of the idea of, you know, it's great to hear a theory. It's great to learn about a theory. It's great to attend a conference or a webinar. But then what do you do with that? Like, do you just sit with that knowledge, or do you actually try to figure out ways to, within your sphere of influence, try to enact those concepts? I think that's such an important idea. Thank you very much. Our next question goes to Jason Seals. Jason, in other venues, you've talked about the power of knowledge of self and their cultural legacy as a means of empowering youth of African descent to think and dream beyond current circumstances for themselves and for their communities. Thinking on both the classroom level and the system level, how do we build to and for this?
Well, when I was in school, I remember reading the classics, Les Miserables, Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird. I didn't read Up From Slavery. I didn't read Souls of Black Folk. I didn't read Native Son. And so a lot of what was happening was my miseducation. Dr. Carter G. Woodson wrote The Miseducation in 1933, which is very much relevant. And what he spoke to is how often the settings where we send our children are facilitating them to think in a way that supports their own demise. And I think that happens in a very intentional way and sometimes unintentional way. And I couple that with a book that's titled Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education, that really begins to explore this dynamic of how school has often shaped an experience that helps Black children specifically accept their subordinate status and prepares them to be in that position in America. And so when I think about knowledge of self and understanding one's history, I think it's important that, you know, when I've worked in locked facilities or in higher ed, I've made it a point to give a comprehensive analysis of the African experience and not to just focus on the trauma and the harm. I think so often African-American studies is just a focus on the enslavement, the atrocities, but African people existed 8,600 years prior to the transatlantic slave trade. And none of that is captured inside of classrooms. None of that is captured inside of learning spaces. And so when I began to teach and share that information, it begins to help the students, the young people, to think about themselves beyond the trauma. It helps them to think about beyond the circumstance. And when I think about my ancestors, African people that were enslaved in the Americas, what I'm very thoughtful of is that no one was asking themselves, well, how do we create a better system of slavery? They were asking themselves, how do we create something that acknowledges my humanity? How do I achieve something that is freedom that some people had never experienced? So for me, what is so powerful is that when students begin to learn about themselves, they begin to expand who they are beyond criminalization, right? Beyond being seen as inferior, right? Beyond their experience that might be emotionally harmful. So it's something very powerful to not just understand who you are, but also have an opportunity to touch that soil. Something that I do at my institution, where we actually go on Black consciousness tours. We pick places throughout the diaspora to take young people so they can have that cultural experience, so they can reconnect to themselves. And so that is one way, but there are so many ways in educational spaces where it's not Black History Month, but it is us always thinking about how do we integrate you. So you see you, so you can imagine you, dream you beyond what is. And so that, for me, that goes back to the question even around the criminalization and the harsh punitive punishments, right? And even giving credit where credit, when we talk about restorative circles and practices came from African indigenous folks. Let's just not just call it, oh, it's restorative practices. Your people were the people that helped to build this, in which we're trying to use to create a space that honors you. You just think how empowering is like, oh, this came from my people. Oh, we using this, and you all actually value my people enough to bring my practices inside of the schools. So for me, it's not just the history, it's taking the history and using curriculum, books, community partners, activities, supportive learning to allow there to be a space where African people get to experience who they are and create narratives and dream. And here's the last thing, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this. We need spaces just to laugh and play, because to me, part of social justice is not just being able to have equity in terms of institutional resources, but also being able to dream and laugh and play and just experience like the beauty of life. And for me, when I'm teaching like that subject matter, that's what we do. We have fun, we're laughing, we're joyous, we're playing, we're crying. You know, to some people, it might feel like a spiritual space and it's an educational space. But for me, it feeds the energy in your body. And so to me, it's a very beautiful thing to take it. I've done this in locked facilities, right? And then you have, the COs walk by and like, what are everybody laughing about? Why are everybody so uplifted? Because we're going beyond where we're at and we're dreaming about another place. Give thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Agree with that 10,000%, and appreciate the thoughts about reclaiming the narrative. Like that's such an important idea, to take back that discussion and for people to individually take back their own narrative as well as the broader narrative. Thank you for your thoughts. And then next we have Jason Williams. Jason, we're going to give you the last word for this section of the Q&A. We talked a lot this morning about the ways schools can support students around the pandemic. What do you think schools and systems should do right now, or stop doing right now, to hand off a more empowering, effective, and responsive educational paradigm to your generation of leaders?
Ultimately, I think just the realization that the community as a whole is just that, a community, from the richest to the poorest, from the whitest to the blackest, they're all the same. And as such, everyone should be given the same opportunities to have the same fun that everybody should. From whether that means if it's a school that draws very little parental attention, parents don't like to come to your activities, then maybe you should just group up all of your after school activities into one. Throw the play the same time as the football game, at the same time that the cheerleaders get to go, everything is just going, so that we have a real show. To host some type of community rally, if you think that you can get enough people out, just so that the school can let out a proper mission statement, let everybody know so that nobody's confused. It's not, oh, I forgot my paper at school. Oh, I lost it. Everybody, parents, children, everybody's getting the same information. And to set the record straight of what the schools expect, not only from an educational perspective, but from an emotional level, in terms of how they expect the student to act within school. And that way the school and the parents can have that dialogue of, hey, well, let's say if my kid is rather smart at the mouth, what are you going to do about that? Like, are you going to go send them in detention, or are we going to talk about it to them? Because then, I want my kid going to your school before any of this even happens. I think that an open, persistent dialogue on part of the school to the parents is really necessary. At the same time, it's also very necessary for the parents to be supportive of the school in whatever way they can. Once again, just relating back to my hometown, one of my friend's parents was always at my school. She knew more teachers than I did, and I never understood it, but I knew that she was always there. She was an active force. I knew that if I needed anything and I didn't want to talk to somebody, she could get it done for me. But it was just knowing that I knew that person outside of school, and hey, they're here in the school pretty often. PTA meetings and everything like that are very important. Ultimately, I would just like to remind everyone that the power is in the hands of the people. So ultimately, it's up to us as a collective whole to decide where we want to take this journey.
Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate your emphasis today on community and about people being connected to each other, and particularly connected in a way that allows them to genuinely understand each other. And that speaks to healing from trauma, that speaks to learning, that speaks to all of the kinds of interactions that we talked about today that really make the difference in somebody's life. So thank you again for your perspective, and thank you for addressing that question. We do have a little bit of time for a couple of audience questions, and so I think we're going to bring all of our panelists up, and I'm going to see if I can. So one of the questions from the audience is, what would you say is the #1 policy recommendation you could provide given today's conversation? What would you say is the #1 policy recommendation you could provide given today's conversation? Let's start with Jason Seals. #1 policy recommendation.
Wow, #1 policy recommendation. I think I would want to enact a policy that supported a different type of leadership inside of schools. I think we haven't really spoken to, I think Tracy and Tammy both mentioned it, but I think it's going to be really important that we have a different type of leadership. I would love to see there were to be maybe co-leadership inside of schools. And I would love to see beyond just that, and maybe this is the priority, and I spoke to it earlier, which is the policy around maybe truly funding our schools. Because there is, I believe, a $23 billion gap in our schools. And yeah, I think I would start there, because I think that would be so important to address, to ensure that there is proper funding and proper resources.
Thanks you very much. I hope I didn't put you on the spot, Jason. I'm sorry if I did. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Just a really quick, probably a little suggestion box for anyone to put anything in around the main office would probably do some help.
Great.
I think for myself, I think there's a real culture war going on in terms of what students are mandated to learn. California, I know in my system, the California State University system, we just, they just passed a bill that mandated ethnic studies for all students going through, like the biggest 4-year public university system. But right now, they are basically excluding ethnic studies educators from how we actually implement ethnic studies in the CSU system. But we also see, again, all these anti-CRT bills, which is directly having impacts on what teachers can teach, right? So right now we have educators who are literally scared to engage in conversations about race and racism because they don't know what the professional implications will be in states such as Texas, Arizona. We already saw what happened in Arizona with anti-Mexican American studies. So I think one policy to examine is regarding curriculum, the role of ethnic studies. And I think that actually addresses a lot of the issues that we talked about today regarding punitive punishment, restorative justice practices, culturally relevant education, pedagogy, etc.
Thank you. Tammy, any thoughts?
So I have to say, I like the policies that I hear coming to the fray out of my co-panelists' mouths, and I would jump on sort of a loosening of the reins on curriculum and pedagogy to include collaborative and independent opportunities to develop course plans for students. So what I mean by that is, if I am 12 years old and I'm interested and passionate about how to build a race car, finding ways within our public education system supported by our community, because this is the ideal world I'm speaking of in this policy, to engage in that process and perhaps apprentice from that point on, really making a priority that engagement, that fun, that joy from the get-go by independently considering the needs and desires of each student's potential outcomes, which might shift over the course of their years in school, but that's what we attend to.
Great, thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you. We're at the end of our panelist question and answer period. I just want to say thank you personally and on behalf of the entire team for your perspective and your responses. I know there's a lot to process. I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to this whole thing to pick up what I missed in the moment. But again, thank you, and I appreciate having been a part of it. Thanks to each of you.
Wow, that was a fantastic discussion. Let me reiterate Dr. Tomassone's thanks to each of you on the panel, and thanks to you, Joe, for being a masterful moderator. This was wonderful. I want to echo back some of the things that stayed with me from what you said. Jason Seals, thanks for reminding us of something simple, fundamental, but we tend to forget. That students haven't really ever been the problem, that it's the system. Thanks for putting it out there, and also for reminding us that conflict and love can coexist. Jason Williams, as a parent that probably should be a little bit more involved in my kids' schools, I hear you, I appreciate your point, and I thank you very much for reminding us that we should make every effort to integrate parents and the community with school. Tammy, you said something early on that stayed with me. The year of 2020, although I guess there isn't an official word for it because they couldn't figure one word out. For me, one of the things that I heard so much is the word reimagine. You used something else. You said, we should be rebooting education, and apologies if I'm butchering what you said. And I think you're right, it is a reboot. It's more than reimagining. So thank you so much for that. Tracy, the unplanned cameo by your kiddo absolutely warmed my heart. So thanks for keeping it real and reminding all of us that behind my green screen, there is a lot of chaos and confusion, and I'm sure for those of you tuning in from home, it is the same. I wanted to say that as a mom of a teenager who's been craving being around his friends during the pandemic, and of a little one with disabilities who absolutely struggled with online education early on, I want to take an opportunity to thank their teachers and all teachers for going above and beyond for our kids in the last 15 months or so. We know that you also are in need of support. So thank you very much for that. Thanks also to each of you in the audience for your insightful questions in the Q&A and chat. Sorry that we didn't get to many of them, but we'll pass them on to the panelists. We'll be back tomorrow for more at 12 p.m. We will then focus our attention to courts evaluating and sustaining court-based innovations. And we look forward very much to the keynote address that will be delivered by the New York State Chief Judge, Janet DeFiore. If you haven't already registered, you can do so, and the registration link should appear magically in chat right about now. And you can find out more about this year's forum, as well as last year's, in our microsite, which will also be available in the chat section. If I can ask Alicia if it's possible for us to share the word cloud that you all built when we asked you, what did you take away from today's event? You will have it on your screen, and if you join us tomorrow, we'll share it again. Thanks so much once more from the YJI. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.